Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights. Thanks, Darin Ostrom, sports card professor, for coming on. We had a long conversation, tightly edited. He has a desire to write a history of sports cards. We talked about that. He wants to go deep, and I love going deep. Thanks, sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Hugs and Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. Here it is.
In 1993, when Finest finally released their first in-pack cards, when they talk about 1989 Upper Deck, they talk about how everybody was collecting the Ken Griffey Jr. card. That's all that mattered, which was not the way it was at the time. It was an important part of it. Likewise, with 93 Finest, they said that's all everybody was buying. What do you remember about how the set was received by audiences?
Pretty well received. Like you said, in 93 Finest wasn't the first Finest. They thought they had perfected the technology. I don't know that it was a mistake for them to not indicate a little R for the refractors. That maybe added some mystique, but those refractors were not well understood and appreciated when they came out. It was a new thing. YouTubers and podcasters have said they'd get a Griffey refractor or something like that, and they say, oh, wow. And the card shop would say, I'll take that off your hands. In fact, I'll give you a whole nother unopened box for your Griffey refractor. And they would do it because there was still a complete set mindset to a much greater degree. A complete set of the 93 Topps Finest. They were beautiful cards at the time. They're still beautiful, but they have issues. But now, unless you have a refractor, it's not a big deal. So yeah, I think they were well received. Nowadays, we think they would have been flying off the shelves so they could get the superstar refractors. When in reality, they were buying it because they wanted to complete the sets, because this is one of the most beautiful cards that had come out to that point and looked almost futuristic.
Well, we still hadn't figured out how to think about parallels, because Wildcard, nobody ever grasped what Wildcard did. They were the most innovative card company ever because they made a card set that would fit in the 2000s, not in 1991. Even Topps Gold. But by 1993, you're right. We were still thinking, you get the base set, a couple of refractors would be cool. It's amazing how much we changed in just a couple of years.
I don't think they were thinking about completing the refractor set. It was a novelty.
I don't mean collecting that set, collect the base set, and a couple of refractors on the side are fun. That was the mindset. Yeah.
Or to be traded back in. It just wasn't thought that they were going to have this stratospheric price. I think Topps didn't even know what they had. If I think back, because I was very active in those days, not buying and selling, but doing the magazines and books about it. I think Topps got caught. We knew more about what they were doing than they did. They did not know how many refractors were produced.
Really? Wow.
They weren't numbered. They were not forthcoming in those days. We would deduce things and have them confirm or deny sometimes, but supposedly there were 241 or 243 refractors made of each guy, but I don't know where that number came from. And then in fact, somebody did a deep dive and started accumulating some player or did something to figure out, hey, you know what? That's low. That's low. But in those days, there was no serial numbering. We don't know how many 92 Topps Gold sets were. There were tons. The gold winners, all this stuff. It was a novelty, but it wasn't based on the value. It was still, I think, completing sets more.
Yeah.
And here's some extra cards that are showing off some technology.
That's part of the fun for me. That's the aspect I remember. It's not that golden, dewy-eyed idea of, the world changed in 1992 with Topps Gold. No, I like looking back and seeing how many years it took for us to actually finally figure it out. That's why the junk wax era happened, where we were buying too much and we were starting to realize, there's too much of this, but we kept buying and buying. And we had to acclimate over the course of the entire 90s from the insane volume early on, slowly every year, a few cards less, find that balance point as we all evolved. And it was 1 decade of slow change at the card shop at every level.
The card shops, there were 10% less card shops every year. The card companies were producing 10% less cards, but raising the price 10% every year. At the end of a certain number of years, all of a sudden, everything's expensive, and where are all the collectors? A little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And Topps, through it all, endured. Fleer did not. Donruss did and didn't. Score did not.
Yeah.
So they all had issues, maybe you're saying like a boiling frog. And yet we're looking at the late 90s with golden age of inserts and parallels.
I love looking at my own journey as an historian going, oh, wow, that's fun. Now, you mentioned card shops dying back. When do you remember the first time there was a card shop that was literally just making money, paying rent on selling cards? No stamps, no coins, no comics.
Oh, you mean in the 80s? There were some in the 80s, sure. But it really caught on late 80s, early 90s, and it probably was peaking somewhere in there. And then the baseball strike just cut baseball off at the knees. That started the precipitous decline such that 10 or 15 years later, 80, 90% were gone.
I really wanted to understand being on the football and basketball side, the baseball strike didn't matter to me. For us on the basketball side, Jordan was back. So it was a whole different story. So baseball, the hit the strike had really did have that big of an impact on the hobby through 95, 96, and 97.
If you say it didn't affect basketball or football as much, you're technically correct, except baseball was, I think, 2/3 of the business. When that 2/3 drops in half, it's a double-digit decline, and that was paying the rent. It wasn't just modern baseball collectors that got fed up and left after the strike. It was vintage as well. There was bad feelings for the players and the owners that this was a betrayal of the public trust. The card companies were at the mercy of these same entities who I don't think decreased their royalty guarantees. And there was no breaking, there was no online. It was strictly a walk-up business, and they couldn't make it.
It sounds like the big effect for the other three sports is that the card shops themselves were the ones that were really taking it. So distribution opportunities for football and basketball and hockey was a little more limited.
When you look back at the red and green PMGs, one of the reasons they're so valuable is I'm not even sure those products sold out. You would think that they were probably selling like hotcakes in the card shops. No, they weren't. They were selling like an interesting basketball set, but I doubt they sold as many as Hoops did, which was the more popularly priced, or the Fleer base brand. So those were just difficult days. And the baseball came back a little bit with Sosa and McGuire, the home run chase, but still, those were awkward years. Because even though starting the basketball magazine and the football magazine was a huge positive step and it put them on the map. But if you look at those early price guides, the prices aren't outrageous. It wasn't anything compared to what we've had now. The last 15 years with Panini doing basketball, I think at some point, right after Luka, I think basketball might have been outselling any other sport. Now football's coming on strong, basketball's falling back, but baseball is always going to be there. You mess with baseball, it's a bad thing. And that was a bad thing for the card shops. And they had nothing to fall back on. Could they sell apparel, caps, jerseys? They just weren't modernized. They didn't have cash register systems. These mom and pops really deserve our full respect because they had one hand tied behind their back. They did it out of passion. There were some years there where they made some good money, and they hung in there. And finally, if their lease was up, they just said, we're done.
With card shows, you've already talked about how when it started off, it was basically like clubs to get together and trade. When did people actually start to be able to travel around the country as a sales force? They could make money traveling around card show to card show.
Even in the 70s, people were doing that, but they were traveling regionally. They weren't flying too much cross country. A couple people did. Remember, inventories in those days, you could fly and take some valuable cards, but even the valuable cards wouldn't be so valuable.
Yeah.
And flights didn't cost much. Mainly, there was a regional circuit in the early, mid, late 70s where I was in Ohio. There were ample, big, great shows within driving distance, within 250 miles, let's say, 200 miles. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a fraternity. It was an open fraternity, almost all guys. So the wives came. I got to know some of the wives because the wives were sometimes there helping, but we were united by passion that we all cared. I don't know anybody that was in it for the money. They weren't thinking, I have to make money. It was like, I love the cards and I love selling cards and I love buying cards and trading cards. That's why they called them conventions. It wasn't like this is a trade show. It was a convention where you came together. There wasn't a lot of education other than the education you get from being next to somebody that was a veteran collector and just kibitzing during the weekend. Very casual, very informal. And then they'd have the hospitality rooms at night, no charge. The promoter would just have some pizza, beer, soda, whatever, and you just talk about the hobby. Then you get tired, you go to your room, go to sleep, come back the next morning. And they were 2-day shows in most cases. And then you'd go home. But the promoters were not cutthroat. They were not trying to scoop the other promoters. That's the other fraternity sense. They were thinking, there's a show in Chicago the first weekend in September. We're going to do Indianapolis the first week in October. And Cincinnati says, we're going to do the first weekend in November. And then Cleveland says, we're going to do the first weekend in December or something. It was like that. You could go to more than one show a month, but there was at least one big one in the Midwest every month. And they were very cooperative. A lot of the same dealers were there. And they had fresh inventory only to the point that they were buying collections in between, which was a big deal back in those days. That was one of my secrets. I found out about cards by buying collections from collectors that had organized them, had partial sets that allowed me to see, hey, every time I find this set, it's missing these same 5 cards. And so I had object knowledge for that. And sometimes there'd be a reason, and sometimes it would be supply, sometimes it'd be demand. Usually supply, I think.
Yeah, I've always felt that the national card show circuit was the first version of social media for us, where ideas and perspectives could actually travel from one side of the country to the other and create a broad conversation.
Yeah. Our guys, when we were going strong in the late 80s, throughout the 90s for sure, before eBay, we had 18 price analysts, including me. And one of us would always be on the West Coast or the Midwest or the East Coast hitting the shows every weekend, 52 weeks a year, such that there were shows. And we'd rotate. So everybody went once a month, it seemed like. And Rich Klein could go to the East Coast most of the time because his parents were still living and he had great contacts there. Grant Sandground could typically go to the West Coast because he'd been at a card shop in LA and knew the ropes there. And Dave Slipka was from Chicago and Alan Muir was from Toronto. So we gave people the home court advantage, but they were out circulating and our magazines, frankly, were part of that information exchange. We worked hard at that. In person is way better than digital. It's more authentic. Digital's hard to beat in terms of the cost, but there's a lot of misinformation on the digital too. Whereas when we went to card shows, it was trust but verify. We could see what was selling.
My thinking was, because we would hang out at card shops and we'd talk about sports, we'd talk about cards, but everything was in the community. And then new ideas, I felt, always came from card shows because you had a whole different perspective traveling around that would pollinate more of a national conversation, which in the analog world that we grew up in is a very different idea than the digital world, a minuscule version of what we've got today.
But I think our magazines were a huge conduit for that.
Yeah.
It's confounded in the sense that we were at the shows. We knew what the buzz was at the shows. We were doing tons of readers' rights where we were trying to get into the conversation topics that would be helpful. And of course, obviously keeping track of who's hot and what the current prices were. And I can't put as much as you're saying on card shows.
Okay.
I think that was important, but at the peak, there were a couple thousand shows a year, something like that. And at the peak, there were probably 20,000 card shops.
Yep.
Could there have been 50 shows every weekend? For sure. We'd go to the biggest 6 or 8. But if you're talking about what shows were the bellwethers, the ones that people said, hey, these dealers are sophisticated, they're well-traveled, they're sharp, they know what's going on, they know what the trends are. That's what we were tracking. We were trying to report it as well. But then you got into the 2000s and the boxes got way more expensive and the prices got way higher.
The new millennium is difficult because everything got so fractured that it wasn't about completing sets and it wasn't even about keeping track of all the cards. Like right now, no card company is releasing card set built on collecting the set. It's about having something special for you. This unique card is just for you. And for me, who's a completist, I can't collect any cards today unless I complete like the base top set. That I can do. But if I'm collecting some Caleb Williams, I can't collect all of the Prism Caleb Williams cards because there's so many of them. I don't even know which ones to collect. And so it's a completely different perspective on collecting in the new millennium than it was in the 90s. And in that chaotic environment, I think that's a big part of what caused everything to fall away.
It's fragmented. We had one main publication that had a very high market share, but people are still completists, Darin. They're not completing the 1 to 792. They have their definition of what complete means. I want all of the refractors for Caleb Williams, or they define a quest that is meaningful to them and fits within their budget. You ought to collect what you like. And if you only like these kind of players or this team, then do that. But the interesting thing to me, 10 years after I'm gone, who's to say there isn't a return to complete set collecting for some of these obscure, higher end products where the base cards are an afterthought? And if somebody did have base complete sets, I'm not saying they'll be rare, but they may be more depreciated than they are now. I don't know that anybody's going the trouble of doing that. They're discards in many cases, other than the rookies.
Yeah, I love watching how the card industry changes. I've spent enough time collecting to know there's no way you can understand where you're going. It's always looking back and trying to figure out how you got to where you are and what it is. I'm fascinated by seeing the different perspectives that newer collectors have toward the hobby.
A bunch of them are herd instinct, that I'll find out what everybody's doing and I'm going to do that. But then there's a fair number we're saying, you know, and I want to zig or zag. So if nobody's doing this, maybe this is the next thing. If we're all lemmings, not a good thing. And if there's no commonality, that's difficult. When I was at the National, brand matters, presentation matters, but it was a very robust selling environment and buying environment too. How do they know to sell to this guy or to buy from this guy? A lot of it's social media. One of the content creators was saying that people, when they went to the National, they didn't just go with an intention to sell cards or buy cards. And it wasn't just to go sell Caleb Williams or buy Caleb Williams. It was to go buy or sell with their favorite content creator, Darin. But there were some noteworthy content creators, many of whom are terrific marketers, who had people going to their booth. I want to sell you my cards. They're not shopping it around, or I want to buy cards from you because I feel like I have a relationship with you.
And that's a new version of Mr. Mint.
People went to the show to see Mr. Mint. He positioned himself front and center. And they said, I want to get some $100 bills from Mr. Mint. They're sitting right there. The problem, Darin, is there's a whole bunch of Mr. Mint wannabes now that have their specific niche, and it just gets loud. Not of that generation, but I'm for progress.
The idea of marketing myself and having that kind of engagement is something that just doesn't fit for me, which is something that certainly hinders my ability to work on the project I'm working on. The YouTube channel I created was done as a collector speaking to collectors. And marketing is something I wish I had the ability to do to get it more out there. Like Dustin, I look at the work that he does, and he and I are opposites. He's got the audience. I've got the deep research. I wish he could get the information I have to his audience. But the whole thing that drives his engagement with his audience is something totally different from what I do. I have a lot of respect for the ability for him and Jeff and others to engage people, get them excited.
I've had both those guys on, and I think they're really good at what they do. And this is something that I deal with, you deal with, they deal with. And that is the appropriate depth on a topic. And not just the appropriate depth, but how it's teased, how it's advertised, how it's promoted, what's the hook, and all that stuff. Both you mentioned are good at the hook, and they're good at not going so deep. And you, I think I don't care about the hook. I think everybody ought to love cards. And I want to go as deep as somebody wants to go, because I think unless you fully understand it, it's subject to twist and misinterpretation. Yet those guys, they'll catch them next time. They're being true to themselves. I'm going to stay true to myself. You're going to stay true to yourself, but you should be on their episodes. And it's not cross-promoting in one sense, other than you would have some content for them to tie into and to make interesting for their listeners and viewers? Are they content creators or content enhancers? I purposely have limited myself due to my very perceptive wife who said, keep it under 15 minutes. There's a limit to how deep you can go if you're 15 minutes. If I do 3 hours, my audience retention after the first hour might not be very good. But after 12 minutes, they're saying he's going to round it up now. And I do. So it's self-protective that I'm not going to go so deep. And Rich Klein, who's just awesome, is brilliant at being able to tell a story, but finish it up, wrap it up in time that we're not going 45 minutes with these great stories. So let's chop it off here and we'll do another one next week.
The man in the house of cards. The man in the house of cards. The man in the house of cards is doing all right.